So now we'll be doing the norma lateralis. This is the lateral view of the skull, which we call as norma lateralis. In the norma lateralis, we can see the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone. Here's the occipital bone. It's somewhat over here. This is the lambdoid suture. So here's the occipital bone. We have the greater wing of sphenoid over here. This is the greater wing of sphenoid. We have the nasal bone. We can see the nasal bone in the lateral view. We can see the lacrimal bone in the lateral view. We can see maxilla, zygomatic bone, maxilla, and the mandible. The ramus of the mandible, especially the ramus of the mandible. We can also see the zygomatic arch. With the temporal bone, there are several parts of the temporal bone that can be seen. The squamous part of the temporal bone, the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Here we can see the tympanic part of the temporal bone. If we look somewhat closer, this is the styloid process of the temporal bone. The sutures that are seen over here, we can see the coronal suture, the squamous suture, lambdoid suture over here, the asterion, which is formed by the parieto-mastoid suture, the occipito-mastoid suture, and the lambdoid suture. The asterion over here. We can also see the pterion, which is basically an edge-shaped junction of the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the squamous part of the temporal bone, and the greater wing of sphenoid. These four bones, they join to form the pterion. Next, we see the zygomatic arch over here. We can also see this frontozygomatic suture, which is formed between the zygomatic process of the frontal bone and the frontal process of the temporal bone. Of the zygomatic frontal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. They form the frontozygomatic suture over here. We have the zygomatic arch, which is formed by the temporal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And then we come to the mandible. The mandible has this lateral surface with the posterior rama and the anterior rama. The posterior rama, which also articulates with the mandibular fossa, is called the condylar process, and this triangular process is the coronoid process. This condylar process, it has the head and the neck. The temporal lines, they are divided into superior and inferior temporal lines. They start from the zygomatic process of the frontal bone as a single line, and then the split, forming the superior and inferior temporal lines. The superior temporal line is faint, while the inferior temporal line progresses and joins the supramastoid crest. Over here, this is the supramastoid crest. And then this part above the zygomatic arch is the temporal fossa, and below the zygomatic arch, if we remove the mandible, it's the infratemporal fossa. Now, the temporal fossa, the superior and posterior boundaries of the temporal fossa are formed by the superior and inferior temporal lines. The anterior boundary is formed by this posterior border of the zygomatic bone. The floor is formed by the bones that join at the pterion, the frontal, the parietal, the greater wing of sphenoid, and the temporal bone. Next, we have this curved plate, the tympanic plate, that forms the boundary of the external acoustic meatus, and we have the mastoid process. The infratemporal fossa, which is below the zygomatic arch. So this infratemporal fossa, I'll just put the skull like that, and now you can clearly see the boundaries. Oh my, the boundaries, okay, never mind. These are the boundaries of the infratemporal fossa. Anteriorly, it's made of the posterior process of the maxilla, posterior boundary of the maxilla. Medially, we have the lateral pterygoid plate, and the infratemporal fossa has the maxillary artery, the mandibular nerve, and the pterygoid venous plexus. The pterion, I forgot to mention this, it's very important. The pterion has the middle meningeal artery and vein, and if there's trauma to this part, the pterion, we will get the epidural hemorrhage. Next, okay, so the infratemporal fossa, we have this infratemporal fossa communicates with the pterygomaxillary fissure. This is the pterygomaxillary fissure between the lateral pterygoid plate and the maxilla. This part, this groove type thing, this is the pterygomaxillary fissure. Now, in this pterygomaxillary fissure, we have the pterygopalatine fossa. So the inferior temporal fossa communicates with the pterygomaxillary fissure, which opens into the pterygopalatine fossa, and then through the pterygopalatine fossa we can communicate with the orbit anteriorly via this inferior orbital fissure. This, where you see my finger, this is the inferior orbital fissure, and through the pterygopalatine fossa we can communicate with the orbits because the inferior orbital fissure opens here. Superiorly, the pterygopalatine fossa can communicate with the skull via the foramen rotundum, and medially it can communicate with the nasal cavity via the sphenopalatine fossa. We also have this we also have this supramastoid crest over here. It is the continuation of the inferior temporal line joins with the supramastoid crest, and this, you can see a triangular depression over here right above this external acoustic meatus. This triangular depression, this is called the suprameatal triangle. It's clinically important because just deep to it we have the mastoid antrum, which basically has air cells. So the surgeons, when doing mastoidectomy, they can access the air cells by pointing out this triangle, the suprameatal triangle. Okay, so the superior boundary of the suprameatal triangle is formed by this line, the supramastoid crest. Anteriorly, it is formed by this posterior-superior boundary of this external acoustic meatus, and posterior-inferiorly, a tangent vertical line drawn from this external acoustic meatus boundary. It forms this posterior boundary of the suprameatal triangle. So we've done the superior boundary, the anterior boundary, the posterior boundary. And this was all about the norma lateralis.